And so now our bundle of 3 verses, which tell of the incapturability and untamability of Behemoth / Leviathan, is 2/3 complete. And as it stands, our 3rd verse of the bundle reads thusly: Job 41:2, Canst thou put an hook into his nose, or bore his jaw through with a thorn? A hook in the nose doesn't seem right nor pleasant, but piercing the cheek, that is, the jaw, with a thorn has some credence, in that after fishes were hauled out, they were hooked in the cheek, a thorn being the hook, and hung on a frame. However, this notion presupposes that Leviathan, that dragon, has been captured already in order to be lifted onto the frame. And it could be argued that this is the same setback with the first stick, in that Leviathan must have been hauled out already for one to put a hook into his nose. Evidently, although there is some correspondence between the sticks, they are not without contention. So, in terms of revelatory excitement, we are first going to inspect the last word in the codex, the noun translated to jaw. In the Hebrew, this word is leki, but if we turn to the Greek Septuagint, we find there that its text has arrived with kilos, which means lip. And this noun has certainly been translated to Greek from the Hebraic word sapha, which also means lip. But do also notice that both of these Greek and Hebraic words mean, in figure, edge or margin, as in a margin of water. Furthermore, we should also notice that the Greek word means of a pouring place, like onto the lip, while the Hebraic word, if we interchange the interchangeables, per, we then get a word which means to pour out. And if we change the just changed k for the similar sounding k, we then get a Hebraic word which means of an emptying place. Therefore, I reckon that it is safe to conclude that kilos was indeed translated from sapha. And next, on turning to the Peshitta, we see there this Aramaic word for cheek, paka, which loosely correlates with the lip from the Septuagint. Howbeit, it does correlate well with jaw from the King James, that is, the Masoretic text. And this word also means of a dropping down, that is, a dropping down of water, a pouring out. And we just learned that sapha has to do with pouring. Therefore, it's of an accordance that paka should truly correlate with sapha. And so paka's definition augments sapha's introduction. Now, with sapha in mind, we now turn our attention to the King James, which, although it doesn't have jaw situated in the last place, this is its situation in the codex, at the end of the verse. As already mentioned, this Hebraic word for jaw is leki, and if we take leki along with its suffix, that is the vav, meaning of him or his, and also lose the initial l for now, we then reveal a word which would fall right into the grand scheme of things, for the word is cheve, which means serpent, a snake. That said, the Hebrews typically used nakas for a generic serpent, and typically chive, with a yod on the end, was used where Aramaic was the prevailing language. However, chive was also used by the Hebrews, just as nakas was also used by Aramaic-speaking people. And this would be akin to our serpent and snake, where snake is used much more than serpent. Nevertheless, as to why chive is preferred here by God Almighty over nakas will doubtlessly be answered in the etymology of chive. But should we have doubts about chive and the use thereof, then let's now pay attention to the verb preceding chive, which, as it stands, is bore, or pierce in the English. Presently, the Hebraic term is tichob, and the root of this word, a word which we have already met, is nachab, to pierce. But now let's notice the initial t of the verb in use, and understand that as a prefix or a suffix it means thou. And we saw this in the previous verse before and after its treatment. And we also saw that this prefix, meaning thou, is situated at the beginning of both verses, that is, at the beginning of each verse's first stick. So out of the 4 sticks in 2 verses, the one that we are treating now is bereft of this prefix. Should it have one? Well, the pesita does, and in all 4 sticks. With this in mind, what we have left after sliding the t away is the p and the b having a vav in between. Yet we know that the vav tendentiously pops up and drops out of words already. And it's not present in the nakab of the Aramaic pesita. Therefore, if we take these 2 consonants, k and b, and append to the end of them the l that I cut off from leki, which resulted in chive for serpent, we then get a verb which means to seize. Therefore, seize the serpent is somewhat apt. However, if we go further and change the k for the similar sounding k, we then get the Hebraic word chebel. And we met this word already in its noun form, which we accommodated into the last verse as rope. Yet in the verb form it means to bind. And binding a serpent is very much an ideal concept when we consider the bigger picture respecting God's challenges to Job, and also that the dragon has just been mentioned in the previous verse. And so at this juncture we can remind ourselves of Isaiah's word. Isaiah 21:7, in that day the Lord with his sore and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan, the piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent, and he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. Notwithstanding, we do note that nakas is employed for both instances of serpent in Isaiah, and this doesn't help in the endorsing of hibe. But now let's bring back into the scope of things this Hebraic word safa, which existed in the Hebrew text, not now existing, which got translated into the Septuagint as lip. For this word safa is not too dissimilar in sound from sefer, and sefer means a viper. Therefore, it is very conceivable that this Hebrew text, which got translated into the Septuagint, had viper before it had lip, where the Masoretic now has jaw. And accordingly, before having jaw, it stands to reason that the text had hebe, meaning serpent, which correlated well to sapha, meaning viper. Therefore, it certainly appears, after all, I have admitted that serpent is indeed the last word in Job 41:2. However, if we are still skeptical, we now turn to the pesita and to its last word in the verse, the word being surah, which, with the right interchanges, arrives at sira. And this Aramaic word indeed means thorn, as in the using of it for a hook. But if we stick with surah as it stands, then we can notice it is derived from the noun chain, which also has its verb form to chain. Furthermore, if we add an a to the beginning of surah and interchange the interchangeables sa and sa, we then also get the noun chain. Also, if we do the interchanges a for e and her for a, we again find the noun chain, even the shackles of a prison. And there are also 4 other forms, all to do with chains and chaining, and such as are in prison also. And with this in mind, we now turn to the King James and to its Hebraic word for its thorn, which the translators translated to hook. And quite simply, if we take this Hebraic word hoak and drop the vav, we get then, behold, the word for chain. And on turning to the Septuagint, we notice that there our newly discovered word also means clasp. And sure enough, our Hebraic word without the vav means clasp also. Consequently, our remedial work of the second stick of Job 41:2 appears complete, beholding the verse thusly, Job 41:2, Canst thou tie an hook into his nose, or with a chain thou bindest the serpent? And binding the serpent with a chain, even a great chain, is a concept verily known unto us. For in Revelation, the serpent is bound with a chain for 1,000 years. Revelation 20 verses 1 and 2. And I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit, and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years. And for those who know and realize that Scripture interprets Scripture, then this should be the clincher that makes us never look back respecting this treatment of the second stick of Job 41:2 at least. And so now, with the second stick of Job 41:2 rectified, we can now look to remedy the first stick by finding word correspondence. We'll begin by finding verb correspondence, of which we already have our newly discovered bind in the second stick. Well, the first place to go would be to the Septuagint, where readily it has the perfect match. For we can see there that the Greek word deo, used in the first stick, means to bind or to tie, a perfect match. Howbeit, Brenton employed fasten in his translation, which does mean bind or tie, of course, yet we can verily see that the Interlinear Apostles' Bible Polyglot by Charles Van der Poel has indeed the verb tie employed. Notwithstanding, the verb that we have in the first stick of the KJV is put or to place, and we can immediately see that it falls short of what the Septuagint has to offer. Furthermore, put isn't a term so befitting in terms of capturing a wild animal, for it would have to be captured already in order to put something on it. We are looking for a more intensive verb, a verb intending on a show of force, like it could be said of bind. To add to this problem, on turning to the Peshitta, we can see there that it has the Aramaic word ramah, which means to cast or to throw. And verily we can see that this word also doesn't measure up to tie found in the Septuagint. Surely tie is the word that we are after. Nonetheless, we cannot ignore put and cast found in the KJV and Peshitta respectively, because if they are indeed wrong, which does seem likely, then we ought to find out why, so as to eliminate them properly and hopefully find out why they are quite different to bind or tie and between themselves. So, if we inspect this compound term in the King James, hatasim, and break it down into its component parts, we have the first consonant h informing us that the sentence is a question, and such a one that expects a negative answer. We also have the consonant t meaning thou, and the rest of the word sum meaning to put or to place. Hence, canst thou put. The compelled answer would be, I cannot put. And what's noticeable by comparison with the previous verse is that our verse does indeed have the initial consonant h, which informs of a rhetorical question which expects a negative answer, while the previous verse doesn't. It's missing. In fact, the previous two verses are missing this indicator, yet all three expect a negative answer as a matter of course. Now, the h and the t are quite similar in shape characters in the Hebrew. And let's suppose that our compound term, which is under scrutiny, is missing another similar looking character, audibly the ch. and that the k begins the verb, which currently stands as soon. And then let's drop the yod from soon, because although we know now that vavs and yods are interchangeables, Gesenius tells us that soon as it stands with a yod is rare. Most commonly it is spelled with the vav, or even with neither. Anyway, the resultant term construction in the English is canst thou shut up, or canst thou stop up. The Hebrew word for this shutting up or stopping up being chasam, and specifically the shutting up is of the mouth or nostrils, i.e. to muzzle. And with this in mind, could it therefore be that the Peshitta's Aramaic also started off with its word for muzzle, which now stands as cast in its place? Well, the Aramaic word for to muzzle is zamam, and if the initial consonant z got itself oversized to a d, then the resultant word would be damam, and a variant of damam is damar. And then, if this recently changed initial consonant d got itself morphed to the resemblant r, then the resultant word would be ramah, which, as we have just seen, means to cast or to throw. And on returning to zamam, meaning to muzzle, we can also notice that it means to tie up, because certainly to tie up the mouth would be to effectuate a muzzle. And perhaps we could also say the same respecting the Hebraic word for to muzzle, chasam, even though Gesenius doesn't explicitly state so. Anyway, to further support where we are going with this investigation, we can see in Brenton's Septuagint that he has employed nostril, where the King James has nose. For indeed, the Greek word means just that, nostril, in the singular. However, a ring in the nostril seems understated. One would expect nostrils, the plural, or even nose. But this Greek word, as it stands in the text, has an unaccountable extra letter, but not enough extra letters to make it a plural in any case. Therefore, this could be indicating that this word was in the plural to begin with and has since suffered corruption. And we could therefore suppose, with good reason, that the verb to muzzle got translated from Hebraic to Greek as stop the nostrils, because Gesenius clearly informs us that chasam in the Hebrew means a stopping of the nostrils. And on turning to the book Ezekiel, we see there this Hebraic word chasam in use, where a stopping of the nostrils or nose would be done to resist the foul stench of death. Accordingly, to present we have two verbs, to tie and to shut up, which appear to be, as we backtrack this, melding into one Hebrew verb meaning to tie up the nostrils or the mouth, to muzzle. However, there is actually more to be unravelled concerning this area of the text yet. For if we examine the Hebraic text of the next word, agmon, a noun, we can see in the lexicon that it defines a bulrush or a reed in the first instance, the KJV having translated this to hook. But then the secondary meaning is a rope of reeds, even a muzzle. Withstanding this secondary meaning, though, is that this secondary definition appears to have been abandoned, but it is incidental that the noun muzzle appeared, albeit erroneously. However, as bulrush, it struggles to remain in the context. The first thing to notice respecting agmon is that if we take the first three consonants and move the aleph from the beginning to the end, the resultant word is also a bulrush. Now, I believe that of the remedial work done here by a transcriber, an aleph was added. For if we take only the g and the m, we have the adverb gam, which means moreover, even, yea, etc. And this adverb, when not a prefix, supplies a sense of addition. It is used for emphasis. And if this be the case, that we have found an original adverb, then by definition we have two verbs to situate, one before and one behind. And although to muzzle can mean to tie up, we really only found support for this in the Aramaic. So let's declare here that we have the two verbs to tie and to shut up to situate each side of the adverb. But which goes where? Well, we are left with the last two consonants of agmon, the vav and the n. And it turns out, so it appears, that these two consonants are actually the vestiges from one consonant which the transcriber of the remedial work took to become a vav and n. And the consonant best suited to this predicament would be the ayin. And if true, then all we need to do is find a Hebraic word for either to tie or to shut up, beginning with the ayin. And we'll hence know the order of placement for these two verbs. And one such word is alal, which means to bind. And knowing this places our verbs accordingly behind and before our newly discovered adverb. And therefore, our revised text now stands thusly. Job 41:2, canst thou shut up, even tie, into his nose, or with a chain canst thou bind the serpent? And now let's concentrate on the remaining noun that we have in the King James, while knowing that we have counterparts for both serpent and chain to find. For here we see this Hebraic compound term beapo, which means in its context, and to be more precise, in his nose. Yet, if we separate the prefix b and then compare the remaining noun to the Hebraic word for asp, we can immediately see that it may have got itself truncated. However, if we take another Hebraic word for a snake, sephifon, which is a horned viper, then we can see that sephifon and beapo have a little in the way of similarity. We notice that they both have a vav and a p, which may line up accordingly, and the second p of sephifon could have been miswritten as the resemblant b, or this breathed p gave way to its voiced counterpart. And if we lose sephifon's initial consonant s and shorten the penultimate consonant vav to a yod, while also shortening the final n to a vav, and then do assume that the p either got itself miswritten as a b or misheard as p's voiced counterpart, then we ultimately arrive at a compound term which means in his mouth. And as we quickly switch our attention to the pesita, we can see there that this remains its rendering in the Aramaic to this day. Of course, these changes probably didn't happen in one go. And then, if we lengthen the vav back to being a final n, while dropping its neighboring yod, and then make harsher the other yod by turning it into an aleph, we then get a word which means annular, circular, and this Hebraic word seems certainly the one that got translated into the Greek as ring, which we can patently witness to in Brenton's Septuagint. Therefore, it now appears certain that sephifon, this horned viper, is the direct counterpart to serpent in the second stick. And now we also know where the devil got his horns from. So now we can review our text as it stands. Job 41:2, canst thou shut up, even tie the viper, or with a chain canst thou bind the serpent? Now, the text may appear complete, but actually we have another noun to find, and such a one to match chain. However, we have used all the text in the King James, that is, the Masoretic text, and the Septuagint has nothing further to offer. In fact, the only word left is in the Peshitta, and the word is bridle. And although tying a bridle to a viper has its merit, a bridle is not really for shutting the mouth. Therefore, as we reconsider the adverb that we recovered and its surrounding verbs, while knowing that the verbs are set for addition, then what else shuts the mouth but a muzzle, and also gets tied on? For it is indeed a thing that is bound to the mouth. And muzzle corresponds with chain in both being restrictors of the animal. And the muzzle would, of course, prevent the viper from biting. All that remains now is to presuppose that the prepositional prefix to also got lost somehow, and we must now include it. And thus, our final render is Job 41:2, canst thou shut up, even tie a muzzle to the viper, or with a chain canst thou bind the serpent? And the clincher to this treatment being accurate is also by scriptural clarification, as we go to Revelation again to the verse following the verse regarding the serpent being bound by a great chain for 1,000 years. For here we can see that the dragon is muted for all this time, and it could be that the shutting up is of his mouth and not his person, though both could be meant. But anyway, to stop the devil from deceiving the nations must imply that he is restricted from speaking. Revelation 20 verse 3, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And lastly, we can see for ourselves just how much of this first stick got dropped somehow, and we may conjecture here that the way that Cephiphon lost its s was due to the fact that only one word could go before in his mouth, or in the ring, as the stick was misheard, and this word is alas, so being made up of the prefix and s, though the unaspirated s. And alas means to rejoice, which would have the stick maybe ending in to rejoice in his mouth. And if we think it strange that at one time the entire stick perhaps read something like, canst thou tie a muzzle to rejoice in his mouth, the interpreters would say that we rejoice in his muzzled mouth, then this is no less strange than what we have already seen, like him taking the river with his eyes, and drawing Leviathan out by his tongue. This, of course, before our remedial work on these verses. And we know that we have some rather strange verses to come as they stand.